Hi,
Hey, how's it going?
it's going well. How are you?
Pretty good. Cool.
All right. So we're live now. Thanks everybody for joining. This is a free course called the Green New Deal for Portland. And this is the first class. So if you signed up for that, then you're in the right place. My name is Nick Caleb. I use he, him pronouns. I work for Breach Collective, and I'm going to be facilitating the next 6 sessions of this course. We're also joined by a very intelligent and experienced guest tonight, Richa Prudial, and she's going to speak probably for about an hour tonight around a just transition framework. So I'll talk probably for 20, 25 minutes and then pass it to Richa. And we'll go from there. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. We'll go from there. Can you, Megan, Richa, can you see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Great, thanks. All righty. So if you're signed up for a Green New Deal for Portland, you're in the right place. I won't be able to see the chat while I have my screen shared. So Megan, Richa, if there's something worth bringing up, feel free to interrupt me. So today, what we're going to do, this is a basic little outline for the day. I'll start by saying just introduce yourselves in the chat, name, pronouns, organization, affiliation, what you're interested in about this course, and also please sign up for the Discord server if you haven't yet. It'll give an opportunity to between sessions for folks to connect and share information if that's something that you want to get out of this. Sorry that we are only on Zoom today. Basically, it's a logistic and planning issues on my side and not being prepared for an influx of a bunch of people, plus getting some responses from folks about participating remotely in this first session. We'll talk about Breach Collective really briefly. We'll do a course overview. I'll give a 15-20 minute topical introduction, and then Richa will present on the just transition framework. And then with any time remaining, we can have more general questions and discussion. All right, so Breach Collective is a pandemic baby. We were born in 2020, and basically we're staff members at 2 different Oregon-based nonprofits. Most of our staff used to work at a nonprofit called our Children's Trust, and I used to work at the Center for Sustainable Economy. Both organizations had labor union drives that informed a lot of the ideas and culture of the employees that eventually came to build Breach Collective. We currently have offices in Eugene and soon in Portland. I guess technically as of this month, we have an office in Portland at the Rebuilding Center alongside 350 PDX. And basically what we do, we've got a couple lawyers, some comms professionals, and some organizers on staff, and we provide legal advocacy, organizing, storytelling, and education support to win grassroots campaigns and build power in the climate and labor movements. We are we're unionized nonprofit. We're worker self-directed, which means that we don't have managers. We have a board that serves as managing for collective bargaining purposes, but the staff manage our affairs in basically a non-hierarchical way. And we are members of Communication Workers of America Local 7901. So this is what the next 6 weeks will look like. Tonight we'll talk about kind of where we find ourselves in history presently, and talk about a just transition framework. Next week, we'll talk about Green New Deal economics, and we'll be joined by Mitch Green, who's a PhD economist locally here. The week after, we'll start talking about policy frameworks, and Sam Diaz from 1,000 Friends of Oregon will join us. The next week will be remote, and it'll just be me talking about policy. After that, Dan Mott's story, the new chapter coordinator at the Sierra Club, chapter director at the Sierra Club, will talk to us about organizing and building power, and do some storytelling around the Portland Clean Energy Fund and how that came to be. And then on May 29th will be the sort of like next steps. Where do we go from here? And I'm pretty sure that we're going to be joined by a staffer from Representative Confam's office who's going to talk to us about transportation policy. So yeah, a lot of different content and a lot of stuff that we can talk about over the course of the next 6 weeks. My goal is to, for folks who are kind of familiar with this content or are in climate, environmental justice, conservation movements already, that you feel more connected and knowledgeable. And for folks who are just coming to this, I hope that you find a way into the Portland climate movement in whatever way works best for you. And for folks who are joining us from outside of Portland or who are interested for a variety of reasons, welcome. We love you as well. And I hope that you get a lot of this as well. All right, so course is called the Green New Deal for Portland. That term, Green New Deal, has basically two meanings. One is very specific, and one is more open to interpretation. My intention is the second, to step into that openness that exists with this concept of the Green New Deal and see how we can develop it locally. And that makes sense for a few different reasons. One is that the Green New Deal, to the extent that that exists, is presently only a resolution that was introduced into Congress in 2019. It was a very ambitious resolution, and it's something I recommend reading it just out of, for historical knowledge and to see what the document looks like. But it's something that tied together ideas around carbon emission reductions, job creation, infrastructure investments, economic justice, resilience, clean energy, sustainable agriculture, manufacturing, transportation, job guarantees, worker rights, indigenous sovereignty, and healthcare. So it was an attempt at putting together an intersectional vision for a new economy in the United States. It didn't happen for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about. Instead, we have a very different future that we sort of are in right now. But for me, this was still a really interesting time. It was a really hopeful time. And I think a lot of those ideas that people were starting to develop, and a lot of those patterns of thinking and a lot of those political movements are still really relevant to our time now. And I think they could be relevant to us in Portland, the region, and nationally. So as many of you recall, the kind of formal Green New Deal, when that name started to pop up in the media, was around the time that sit-ins were happening in congressional offices in Washington, D.C. And basically, people who were associated with the Sunrise Movement started doing sit-ins and demanding big climate policy out of Congress, and at that point, President Donald Trump. They advanced this resolution, House Resolution 109, with a bunch of co-sponsors that had all that content that I was talking about. This is a really interesting time in 2019. It feels like a forever ago, but if folks can think back to kind of the pre-pandemic world, the fall of 2019 was a time of a lot of optimism and activity. Globally, there were humongous climate protests happening everywhere. In Portland, we also had a gigantic youth climate strike in the fall of that year that had thousands of youth coming out to protest against climate polluters and call for a new vision for an economy. And locally, the climate movement was at its peak that we've seen in the last decade or so. In 2018, the Portland Clean Energy Fund passed kind of like a a mini local Green New Deal that taxes basically big box stores, their gross profits, and puts it into programs for clean energy and job training, and a lot of sort of infrastructure upgrades and a whole bunch of other really, really interesting community-driven projects. Was designed by the community, put on the ballot, and overwhelmingly passed. Like over 60% of Portlanders passed that. It was so popular at the time that even the people who definitely hated it didn't even really put up a fight because they knew that it wouldn't have been worth it. In the years before that, we passed laws calling for 100% clean energy in the city. We passed rules preventing new fossil fuel infrastructure from being built. Basically, the climate movement in Portland was very, very strong, both at an activist level, a community level, and also policy level. So the future did look pretty bright, even though the national politics were messy. Another kind of touch point, Bernie Sanders running for president, calling for like $16 trillion of investments. So the scale that was being talked about from like sort of credible politics at that time was very optimistic. And then in March of 2020, the coronavirus came into existence, or at least we became aware of it, and it started infecting human populations all over the globe very rapidly. And we were in the midst of a pandemic, and pretty much everything changed. But I wanted to talk about this just a little bit because it's worth remembering, I think, the bad and sort of the interesting parts of the pandemic. From a starting point, not great to have a pandemic sweeping the globe and causing death and serious injury and long-term illnesses to people, and leaving a lot of people, myself included, severely weakened from contact with the virus. There were also parts of the response to COVID that are good to understand because they are relevant to how we can think about international climate policy. So one of those is that the primary intended fix to COVID, or attempted fix to COVID, was a technological solution, right? The creation of vaccines that was entrusted entirely to the private sector. We saw how the intellectual property regime was utilized basically to harm people, especially poor people throughout the globe. And so it was, from the American perspective, a really like nationalistic response, using American technology and American property regimes to like promote American recovery and protection first. And that's something that can be analogized directly to the climate situation that we're in. At the same time, there were also really interesting developments where in a lot of places in the world, like it was like air pollution was cleaning up because people weren't driving as much anymore. And there were things like workers being celebrated. I remember in my neighborhood in Northeast Portland, people would go out at like, 7 p.m. every night and like thank workers for like continuing to provide things, right? And so there was like a consciousness of like service that was happening, and awareness of that isn't always in our culture. The basic understanding was around collective action and people needing to work together to solve a big problem. The oil industry almost collapsed, which I count as a positive thing in my book, and was only rescued because the government bailed it out. And maybe under different political circumstances, that could have been done in a different way. And we had stuff like student debt payments were paused, and people thought they were going to be canceled, and people were getting stimulus checks. And for a moment in time, there was actually like a social consciousness that like went back into the political world, and we were starting to see maybe some of these things that would have been aligned with the ideas of the Green New Deal. In Portland and elsewhere in the United States, we also had very large protests that kicked off after the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And so it was a very intense time around activism as well. And sort of in the wake of the protests and the lockdown stage of the pandemic. Where we're going now is a very reactionary political environment, unfortunately. A lot of people's brains have gone into let's say back to the 1980s in a lot of ways. We're back into like war on crime, war on drugs mentality in a very, very strong way. The political sort of like center has moved well to the right in the time since. And so this moment in time, sort of on the front end, maybe had some optimistic points. And by the end of like 2022, we'd had entered a pretty reactionary phase that I think we're still in today. And, you know, also, while that movement was happening, we did get ostensibly something like climate policy at the federal level through the Inflation Reduction Act. Inflation Reduction Act is a huge bill. It had a lot of different items in it other than energy-related issues, like healthcare and prescription drug costs and some tax measures and things like that for getting more revenue for the federal government. But from a sort of like a climate perspective, the stuff that's most relevant is around energy policy. And basically, the Inflation Reduction Act is a tax credit bill that incentivizes a lot of different activities by the means of allowing for tax credits. So it doesn't really, there's not a ton of changes in direct policy or regulation, mostly about trying to like steer the market through tax related mechanisms. However, there are a couple of provisions that I think we'll talk about more next week. One of them called direct pay that are very, very interesting and different from those tax credit policies, where it may allow for basically like local governments, NGOs, tribal organizations to do pretty large energy projects in the public domain if they wanted to do it. And so next week we'll talk a little bit about that. But basically, the RA, you could call it green capitalism, I guess, for shorthand. It was about changing sort of who would be the winners of like the investment economy. It gave signals to investors about where to put their money and tried to direct that toward clean energy development, clean manufacturing, also false solutions for the fossil fuel industry to say they're going to do carbon capture and a bunch of plans that are basically not feasible, but they'll get a bunch of tax cuts for investing and things and keeping control. But there are some interesting incentives that we'll talk about next week. This is just to give an example of where the tax portions of the Inflation Reduction Act were aimed. So clean energy, carbon capture, alternative fuels, EV production and changes out, clean hydrogen, nuclear energy. There's also a lot of consumer tax credits, not just industrial tax credits and investor tax credits, but you can get like, you can change out electric infrastructure in your own house to put in electric appliances and get tax credits and rebates for that kind of stuff. Electric car rebates, things like that. Again, we'll talk about it more next week. But it is, massively significant piece of legislation and interesting both for what it does and what it didn't do and sort of over whose objections it was passed in real time. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit next week. It also pretty much immediately changed the market around mining and minerals acquisition because of the demand that it creates for rare earth minerals that are essential for the production of clean energy technologies. And so this is something that has caused a lot of people in the international climate movement to be, and mining safety and international justice and fairness movements to be really worried about as well. So how this will actually unfold is an important question. Also, while US internal policy was moving in a direction more toward clean energy, we're also exporting LNG, liquefied natural gas, a lot more, which is raising gas costs for American consumers and also continuing carbon pollution. Some of this is due to, actually, a lot of it's probably due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how that changed international gas markets. But American gas exporters seized on this in terms of turning up production in a pretty effective way. And so we're not necessarily reducing overall emissions, even as the US changes its internal economic policy to more clean energy friendly investment structures. And, really important and also is that we not only see like Russia-Ukraine dynamics happening, but a genocide actively taking place in Gaza right now that in its own right is, worth getting involved in trying to stop, but also from the perspective of climate justice and international climate justice is really important to understand that this is the future if we don't change directions, where you have like walled in areas of affluence and technological barriers, technological policing and weapons, basically separating affluent societies from poor societies that are fleeing climate emergencies and trying to get water and basic resources and things like that. And so I think it's a really important time to take note of the ways in which climate justice frameworks and international justice frameworks are basically the same thing in this moment in time and will be into the future. And to that end, there's a really good article in The Guardian today by an excellent journalist called Darna Noor, talking about how on campuses, the presently anti-fossil fuel and ceasefire activists are seeing that like those connections really clearly and starting to express them and tell stories about them in ways that are important. And they're highlighting how their universities are invested in extractive economy and also, like human rights abuses abroad and how these things are really closely related. And there's a really nice webinar on May 7th from the Climate Community Project that I just became aware of today that I thought I would direct folks to as well, that is really tying the narrative between Palestine climate justice. So I'm gonna stop basically here and just transition into the next portion of the day's content by pointing out that there are a lot of different ways to think about climate change. And one of the major stories that's told is the kind of we're all in this together story. And in some ways that's true. I mean, we all do exist on the planet, but we do exist in a world that has inequality. It's got technological imbalances, and those are things that are exacerbated through climate change. Climate change is not an apocalypse. It isn't like the analogy that was made in that movie about the asteroid. What was it called? I can't remember. Where they were like, this is like an asteroid coming to Earth. It's like actually not like that, really, and fundamentally. Climate change is something that will intensify and unroll over time. And it's something that will affect a lot of people differently. Some people far more intensely, and some people won't feel the effects as acutely. Their lives won't be threatened. They won't be at risk of starvation and things like that. It's possible to keep an affluent, albeit much smaller affluent society going for quite some time. And so the inequalities, the class inequalities, racial dynamics and inequalities, these are all massively important as we think about how we're going to structure our transitions locally, regionally, and nationally. And so I'll stop there and pass to Richa.
Thank you, Nick. And can you give me access to share my screen? It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Yeah, did that work, making you a co-host?
Yes. So welcome everyone, and give me just a moment here. Okay, great. So now I am in the position of not seeing the chat, so feel free to let me know, Nick, if anything comes through. But hey, everybody, my name is Richa Podell. I am a freelancer. I am a climate justice practitioner. I feel like I'm giving this as like just a person who cares, that is studied the just transition framework both in work and on my own, and it's really given me a just a way of thinking about where we are right now and where we want to head that has really resonated, that has felt really holistic, that considers the fact that we are battling multiple global crises at once. And so I'm here to spend this next hour to really get into the framework with you, whether or not you're familiar with it. I know some of you who are here, so I think some of you I've like been through this training with before, but every time that I've interacted with this framework, it's deepened my kind of commitment to the work and my understanding of what we're here to do together. So I hope that it's helpful to you all. And just for what to expect in this like next hour-ish. So Nick really brought us nicely into kind of this present moment in the last few years in our political economy, and the optimism and the not so optimistic moments. I will be taking us kind of like a more of a zoom out from where we just were, a step back, looking at even the larger context of the climate justice movement as a whole, on the global context of where we are now and how we got here. And then I'll introduce the just transition framework and some of the main tenets of that framework and how we can grapple with them when we think about doing our work locally, wherever we are. I said here in Portland, but wherever you are in Oregon. And then, we'll have some time at the end for discussion. And then we will also take a break, so around 6:30, I'll aim to get us into a break. And then, I just wanted to disclaim that I won't be able to explore all the ways in which this framework applies to everyone's work. Folks are coming in here from different areas and sectors, but I'm hoping you have this awesome course ahead of you, and so I'm hoping that this is a good starting point and that you can keep mulling over some of these concepts over the course of the next few weeks. And so, as Nick already kind of mentioned, we're looking at a climate crisis that isn't just a climate crisis. So first of all, the climate crisis that we're in right now is a symptom of the social inequity, and it's not the root cause of the problem. And so that's why we so often end up pursuing false solutions, because they don't treat the root cause of the problems, which is the way that our economy is actually structured and the way that it exploits both people and land. And then the climate crisis affects people, not only planet, and does not affect everyone equally. So a lot of solutions are also false when they're not addressing the impacts on people or perpetuating exploitative practices against people. And then we know that some communities are just much more at risk and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change itself: air, water, food access, having a home. And then, in order to really change the direction that we're headed in, our solutions must be addressing these root causes. So those are the root causes that I'm really interested in getting into with y'all. So how did we get to the climate crisis that we're in today? When I do the full version of this workshop in person, I have like a big gallery walk that I have people walk through. And so since I'm not doing that, I'm like, how am I gonna encompass all of this history? So this is totally not comprehensive of all world and US history up until this moment, but just a few highlights on kind of how we ended up where we are. So starting from the beginning of this country after it was stolen, So 1607 is when the English established its first colony, Jamestown, inside the territory of an Indian confederacy, the Powhatan tribe, who had been living in what is now Eastern Virginia for thousands of years. This was the beginning of colonial settlement in what is now known as the United States, and it also marks the beginning of Native resistance to colonialism in the U.S. So those resistance started as soon as colonization started. And then just 12 years later, in 1619, 20 enslaved Africans were brought to the British colonies against their will, arriving in what is now Fort Hampton, Virginia. And so 1619 marks the beginning of the legal enslavement of African folks in the US. So early 1600s are the beginning of white powers taking over this country, this land. Is the same time, basically the same time slavery starts, and the same time that displacement and violence and genocide against Native peoples begins. In 1620, 102 passengers arrived to the British colonies on the Mayflower. The governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, at the time there's a documentation of basically creating the excuse to take land by saying that Native Americans had not subdued the land and therefore only had a natural right to it, but not a civil right. And that a natural right had no legal standing. So colonists, it basically gave colonists the right to take land legally. So that's the relationship to land that this country was kind of founded on, the way that the political system and economy is propped up. And then in the 1700s, we've got the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, in particular in the 1750s. Industrial Revolution begins, new technologies and social arrangements enable extraction and use of Earth's resources to grow exponentially. And so this will become kind of the fossil economy that will rely on constant, large-scale burning of fossil fuels. In England, in the 1700s, in late 1700s, the rotary steam engine is invented. Unlike earlier machines, it's more immune to, previous limitations of time and of weather. And this becomes an opportunity for capitalists to seize too, to exploit workers for huge profits, demanding increased hours of labor per day in centralized factories, and then the byproduct is CO2 emissions. Then we've got 1800s, which is coal industry and the beginnings of model oil industry. So 1825 is a year noted for coal production and consumption increasing tremendously. That trend continues for the rest of the 1800s. And then we know this, but extracting coal involves so many steps and involves so many workers. And so as the use of coal increases and soars, we've got coal workers being exploited and then also uniting to resist exploitation and to fight for safer working conditions, shorter days, higher wages. So many of the same things that workers are fighting for now. 1850 to 1859, modern oil. So the first commercial engine drilled oil well in the United States is drilled in Pennsylvania. The first US oil refinery opens up 2 years later as companies and commercial mines also form in other parts of the world. And thus the modern oil industry begins, fueling vehicles, fueling heaters, lamps, and stoves, kind of running the new economy that is built on stolen land and that is basically developed a forceful relationship to the land. Continued all throughout this time, continued displacement and genocide of Native peoples. In the 1830s, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creeks were forced to move westward on foot, often in chains with little food or supplies. In 1838, the president at the time, Martin Van Buren, sent federal troops to march the remaining Southern Cherokee holdouts who were refusing to move 1,200 miles to Indian Territory in the plains. Folks were dying of disease and starvation. Thousands died. And that's what gave that torturous journey the name Trail of Tears. And so all while, industry is booming, we are still exploiting and it just treating people with no humanity. Our institutions are not treating people with humanity. It was only in 1851, also in the 1800s, Congress passed the Indian Appropriations Act, which created the Indian reservation system that still exists today. At that time, Native Americans weren't allowed to leave their reservations at all without permission. So we've stolen Native land and then forced them violently into forced displacement. Created reservations to keep them separate from the rest of the world, and they're not even allowed to leave. And then in the late 1800s, so within the century of kind of coal and oil booming, we've just got worker strikes. We've got coal miners striking globally here in the US. In Germany, nearly 100,000 coal miners go on strike to demand higher wages and shorter work days. At the time, these strikes pushed the emperor to introduce a labor reform program and call for a conference of European leaders to discuss how to manage the growing demands of united workers. And then in the 1900s, when we move there, the Western elites will kind of increasingly invest in oil-based energy systems as a hope that maybe they could avoid the effective strikes and labor power that characterize coal production. And then, at the same time, as all of these things are happening in conjunction with one another, 1800s, we still have Jim Crow laws put into place and thriving, which are kind of the legacy of slavery, where we have legalized racial segregation taking place. So you can just see as what things are happening at the same time, and that our separation from each other and white supremacy is a thread that characterizes all of our history in this country. And then we've got 1900s, 1914, World War I begins, killing roughly 20 million people. And so fighting in wars for us transitions from mainly human and animal powered to fossil fuel powered technology. So now we have trucks, tanks, ships, airplanes. Land has always, even before, caused war and conflict between groups, but now we have accessing and protecting fossil fuel supplies as part of sustaining a powerful military, and we see that reflected in our military today. Even with Gaza, we know that our investment in Israel has a lot to do with resources. And then World War II, beginning in 1941. So the US officially enters World War II following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. And in the years prior to that attack, the US had placed harsh economic restrictions on trade with Japan, including an embargo on the sale of crude oil and petroleum products. And so Japan had, which at that time was almost entirely dependent upon US imports for its oil, viewed that embargo as an act of war. And that's part of what led to that escalation. And there's so much is not being captured on this one slide of world history, but folks feel free to flag any events that you see as part of being our history in the chat. Moving into the 1920s, the US Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, so granting citizenship to all Native Americans born within the territorial limits of the country. Before that, citizenship had been limited depending on what percentage of Native American ancestry a person had, whether they're veterans, whether they're women or married to US citizens. So even just it was so tough for the US to accept people as citizens of this country that have lived on this land for so long before us. 1942, just going to talk a little bit about the farm workers movement in the 1900s. But so 1942, during World War II, the Bracero program was designed to recruit Mexican laborers to replace those that had been sent to war. So in Oregon and California in particular, this was used quite heavily, but the program was used as a tactic for landowners to end labor organizing, to stomp it down. So whenever there were rumors of workers that were organizing for better conditions, agriculture companies would deport their current workforce and replace new workers from Mexico, just showing how far have we really come from slavery that our labor is that expendable. In 1965, the United Farm Workers and Delano Grape Strike, so over 800 Filipino farm workers affiliated with the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC, struck 10 grape vineyards around Delano as a strike, and they demanded a raise in both their hourly wages. It's all the same. It's wages and conditions and hours. From at that time, their hourly wage was $1.25. They were demanding $1.40 an hour. And in addition to the piece rate, so the pay that they earn for each box of grapes picked. In this case, by 1970, the grape strike and boycott was successful, and table grape growers were able to sign their first union contracts that granted them better pay, benefits, and protections. In the 1966 is when Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta organized their famous 250-mile march from Delano, California to Sacramento, lobbying for better working conditions as well. It was a march that started with only a few dozen people, but led to thousands of folks who showed up to the state capitol and were able to garner some specific support from senators who did end up kind of calling out some of the local sheriffs and district attorneys for harassing marchers and subjecting them to unconstitutional arrests, not unlike the treatment of protesters today. And then the last thing I'll kind of mention, in the late 1900s, 1993, just a global farm workers movement. So farmers across the globe for La Via Campesina, an international movement which coordinated peasant organizations of small and middle scale producers, agricultural workers, rural women, indigenous communities from across the country, and a global movement really advocating for food sovereignty, so the rights of those who grow the food to get to make all the decisions about how it's produced and distributed, from ensuring that the food is made without any poisonous chemicals, to providing for local communities, to also minimizing transportation and fossil fuel use in the distribution of food. And so that movement it was over 200 million members in 81 countries fighting for agricultural, economic, and environmental justice. And it was really noted as one of the largest social movements of the world. So we just see, I think, like much more history to study to really understand the connection between these issues. But even just from a highlight of a few events, we know that the climate justice movement and the crisis that we're in is a result of kind of the following broader things that have happened. So people have been separated from their land and their relationships to land. So that's both colonization, that's displacement of all different kinds, that's being forced to work the land, having that coercive relationship to land rather than a regenerative one. So that's the second one, is human labor being forced and applied to these extractive processes with natural resources, whether or not, people wanted to, they're being forced to interact in that way. Separation of people from each other, so institutionalized racism that makes us feel like, and then also the division between wealthy and not, business owners and workers, making us feel like we are, we are separate, we are out for our own, that we cannot be coming together for things that we care about. And then separation of people from ourselves. If we see ourselves as part of nature, we see that we are super disconnected from nature and have and history has done that to us. And so we know, I mean, just we know as people when we're in a peaceful relationship with nature, whether you are taking a walk or you are tending to the land, you are in a better place as a person, and it brings you stability and a sense of you are where you're supposed to be. So on a more personal note, we have become separate from our bodies as well through this institutionalized conditioning. So yeah, in realizing how awful it's been, I turned to the Just Transition framework to help me both have hope, but also feel rooted in some strategies, some truths and some strategies on how to move forward. So the Just Transition framework is a vision-led, unifying, and place-based set of principles, processes, and practices that build economic and political power that help us to shift from the extractive economy that history has brought us towards to a new and beautiful regenerative economy. And the way that I'll be presenting it today is mostly taken from Oakland-based nonprofit Movement Generation. They have, I mean, these strategies have been employed by organizers and strikers and policymakers for, I mean, I feel like since the 70s, but the Movement Generation is an organization that really put together this framework to help disseminate into community spaces like this one. And so the framework asks us first to grapple with just the word economy. So when we think of economy, we think of, now we think of trade and international relations, and we think of jobs. Are there enough jobs for people? Maybe we think of stocks. Maybe we think of Wall Street. But if we look at the etymology of the word, if we break it down, we see that eco comes from the Greek word oikos, which means home, and nomi, which means management. So economy actually just means the management of our home. How do we manage our home? And if we use that eco means home, that applies to all kinds of anything that says eco in it. So even like when we think of ecology, that is like the study of our home. How well do we know our home and study our home? Ecological justice, how do we find that balance in our home? So we've gotten kind of far from what economy is actually meant to do, if we think of what it actually means. And so the framework basically puts forward, if economy is the management of home, then what are the basic foundations of our economy, of any economy? And so the framework says all economies can basically be thought of as built from a common set of pillars, these 5 pillars. At the heart of any economy is a kind of deceptively simple set of relationships. So in this image, you can see on the left, you take resources, natural resources, you combine them with work in the center, which we should really consider a very precious natural resource. And then that resources and work are applied to some purpose in the economy. There must also be a culture or worldview that makes this economy make sense to people who participate in it. And that kind of sets the limits of like what is acceptable and what's not. So there's kind of like a worldview umbrella that everything, these natural resources and work are being used under to prop up this purpose. And then finally, there's governance at the bottom there, which is the organization and the facilitation of the ideally smooth functioning of the economy towards its purpose. So yeah, the Just Transition framework says basically you can think of any economy in these 5 pillars, both the one that we are in right now, which is the extractive economy. So here are the pillars of the extractive economy, if we were to apply that. So here in our current moment, the way our economy is running, the primary purpose is the accumulation, concentration, and enclosure of wealth and power. So while those who control these enclosures, the global 1%, their corporations, they might claim, and even maybe they even believe it, that the purpose of the economy is to lift all boats, or to eliminate poverty, or to create opportunity for everyone, and operating in this sort of meritocracy. The fact is that these ambitions have not been the result of the basic formula of the economy. So therefore, these claims just do not define our current purpose of the economy, regardless of their intentions. The purpose of a system can only be determined by what it actually does, what it's actually producing. So we must kind of reasonably conclude that the purpose of the dominant economy is the concentration and enclosure of wealth and power, regardless of consequence, regardless of toll that it takes on people or planet. And so this extractive economy is fueled by natural resources that are acquired through extraction, so the forced removal of resources from their rightful place in living systems. So that's kind of the way that we use resources now. And then work, human labor, again, particularly precious. Work can be really thought of as one of the key features that define all living things. And in an extractive economy, for it to all work towards this purpose, human labor must be organized, so our work, through coercion and exploitation. Exploitation has taken many forms, from slavery to waged labor, to child labor, to devaluing certain kinds of labor, labor of care. And so in the extractive economy today, the framework basically posits, we are expected to divorce all of our values, our deepest sense of what is right and wrong, from labor. We work in order to get a paycheck, put a roof over our heads, food on our plates if we're lucky, and to meet our needs in these systems. In this system, we basically will do anything. We don't have much choice. And so that's why we kind of say that human exploitation really enables ecological erosion. We will exploit the earth if we need to, if it is to take care of our kind of monetary and needs of living, basic needs. So that's purpose, resources, and work. And so then the worldview that we're kind of operating under here in the extractive economy is a culture of life without limits. It's often couched in the rhetoric of freedom, but it's only a very specific kind of freedom. So we have the freedom to choose between dozens of brands of toilet paper, or between one of two political parties, but we don't have the freedom to control our own livelihoods. It's a culture that's based on consumerism. So if the purpose is here enclosure of wealth and power, consumerism is like the paradigm that justifies it. It gets us to buy into the idea that the measure of our own individual worth is kind of our little accumulations of wealth or status. And the underlying assumption here is that infinite growth is possible. So the assumption maintains that we can just keep growing our economy. We can keep producing and producing and producing, always creating more wealth and more stuff, and that there's no ecological or social limits in doing so, which we obviously know is not true. And then lastly, governance. So we can't separate governance from economy. Governance is the system of rules and how they are enforced. And governance will always be kind of subordinate to serving the purpose of the economy. So to govern is literally to steer. So in this case, what are we steering? We're steering the management of home. Who are we steering it for? For those who continue to accumulate and enclose wealth and power. So the form of governance is really always determined by whatever the purpose of the economy is. That's the line that's drawn between those two. So if the acquisition of resources, including labor, are through extraction, then the ultimate mechanism of government has to be militarism. So structured, well-organized, systematic violence. diverse in its forms and methods, as we see around in our country and around the world, but always brutal. It's really the only way that the system can be propped up. And so just a couple examples of how, I'm sure a lot of us can think of examples both locally and globally of how this economy is playing out. But here globally, we've got, Democratic Republic of Congo, just children as young as 6 are risking their lives in toxic dust to mine cobalt for the world's largest electronic companies. And in this example, labor of the children and adults in the Congo are being so exploited, taken forcefully for the benefit of wealthy classes in Western states. And, we benefit as like people that have phones, enough money to have phones, but we're not even the ones that benefit the most. The folks that benefit the most are, those who own the electronic community companies and shareholders, and those who are in that kind of upper 1%. Clearly the purpose of the economy here is not the well-being of everybody. It's the wealth for very specific people at the expense of health and lives of folks in the Congo. And then a more local or US example, we hear things happening in other countries, but here too, in the US, we have an example of Hazard, Kentucky, which I only recently learned about, a town that was built around coal. Most residents who currently live here come from a long line of coal workers, and the booms and the bust of the coal industry were felt in every household in this town. And once coal mines are being shut down, the town experienced a huge series of layoffs in 2016. Hazard is an example of the extractive economy hard at work under the name of growing the economy. These folks that lived in this town were promised so much growth. In reality, workers are being exploited, their health is being risked, and the town and industry now, there's been a huge oil spill, or a sludge spill actually in their water. And the surrounding area is heavily polluted. There's a film that I've been meaning to see that I don't know if anyone has seen, called Sludge, a 2015 film about this huge sludge spill that hardly received any news coverage. And then once the industry dies down or isn't working anymore, workers are left to figure it out, and this town is left to figure out how to keep surviving both in a contaminated space and with no industry left. And I just want to share, we'll do this and then we'll head to break. But there's this music duo called the Local Honeys that sing about this phenomenon in Kentucky and are really powerful. So I'm hoping that I can see if my share screen is going to be able to. I might have to just ask you if I'm able to hear it. Can you hear it? Nick, can you hear?
Kind of.
Kind of.
There's sound, but it's not coming through super clear.
Okay.
Anybody in the chat hear it more clearly?
Let's see if I can do this and this. So now.
Smell like money on land you reclaim. Top off that sludge pond. plant an herb, you can't help but leave the sky. We can still flip you the bird. What will we do with no mountains to climb and you disappear and you shut down the mines? Pray God gives you mercy, the place you should dwell, that you don't burn like coal and you're sentenced to hell. Why not plant cigarette trees? They burn faster than you'd long these. Fill up them valleys, slurry them streams. Big old king cold on you, lose any sleep.
Yeah, so just I think that song and just these examples are a reminder of just how much humanity we're missing out on when we're putting forward climate solutions that are false or that aren't acknowledging the impact on people. And yeah, I'll throw in the song link in the chat maybe during our break. But let's go ahead and move into a break, and I think we'll have time to do a full 10 minutes. So please take 10 minutes. We'll come back and I'll do a quick move us into the regenerative economy and where we want to be headed away from this really harmful relationship to planet and Earth. Okay, actually, maybe I'm gonna I know I just said 10 minutes, but I'm actually gonna say 7 minutes now that I'm realizing the next part that I'm gonna talk through. So let's be back at 6:40, please. All right. Hey, folks, welcome back. Am I still sharing my screen right now? No. Okay. Let's get back to doing that. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and keep going. And I'm realizing I'm like a little behind. So I'll try to get through this next section a little quickly so we can get to some discussion. But yeah, we've really just spent time looking at how the pillars of the economy apply to our current extractive, terrible economy that we're currently propping up. But this framework is also a way for us to look at where we want to head and map out the new economy that we want to build, the regenerative economy. And so here are how we can apply those basic 5 pillars again, but towards an economy where we have really regenerative relationship with each other and the land. So in the regenerative economy, the culture or the worldview at the top, that kind of is the umbrella culture of our economy, must be based on caring and sacredness of relationships to each other and the world upon which we depend. So this is a culture where love, humility, and mystery guide us instead of entitlement and arrogance, a culture of constraint versus that like growth without limits. And then one where we see ourselves as a part of and not separate from, apart from a living world, a world where many worlds fit. So kind of knowing the scale and the pace and the implications of ecological erosion, the consequent collapse of biological and cultural diversity, we have to realign the purpose of our economy to be more aligned with the healing powers of Mother Earth. So we've got to fundamentally remake the purpose of our entire economy towards ecological restoration, community resilience, and social equity. And then we kind of, if that's the purpose, if the purpose is just everyone's well-being and the well-being of planet Earth, then resources have to be acquired differently through regeneration. We've got to build rather than deplete soil. We must engage forests and rivers in a way that provide for our needs, but at a scale and a pace that is aligned with living systems. So aligned with the water cycle, the soil cycle, composition and decomposition. Our work has to be organized. So rather than being coerced, our work has to be organized through democratic and voluntary cooperation rather than coercion and exploitation. You know, how much is possible if we're able to freely apply our labor together to solve our problems and meet our needs. In doing so, we'll both liberate the soil from the physical concrete that paves over life. Quote from the movement Generation Just Transition zine, and liberate our spirits from the cognitive concrete that has paved over our imaginations. And then when we think about work, it's also important to imagine this future economy where work is not just jobs. Our work is not only producing goods, growing food, building homes, providing services, but our work is just much more than that narrow definition. Our work is everything that we do. So embracing our families, caring for our communities, how we intervene when anyone in our community is harming or hurting, the beating of our hearts, the roles we play from caregivers to carpenters, healers, plumbers, artists, farmers, elders, warriors. We just can't afford to keep participating and indulging in this very crude reduction of the great power of our work. And in some ways, it's what we're here to do, is offer work to something. And then, so when we talk about governance in the regenerative economy, what are the features of governance? First, there must be deep democracy. So deep democracy will be diverse in forms across place, but at the core, it's basically a saying, you know, people are actually in control of decisions that affect their daily lives. So from where they work, how they manage shared resources across scales. And then another feature that the framework puts forward around deep democracy is that primary decision-making happens at the smallest scale that's appropriate to the arena that is trying to be governed. So acknowledging that different arenas of governance demand different boundaries. So water should be governed at the watershed scale, where all the people impacted in the watershed and take care of the watershed are involved. Trade should be governed in a different way than the workplace or the food shed. I often think about this framework in the regenerative economy, even as like to start as like within a home, whether it's a home of family members or roommates or a couple, or just how is that home governed? Do people have a say in kind of how that home is governed? So yeah, so these are the pillars of the regenerative economy. And although it can feel super, kind of, how are we going to get there? And is that even possible? I think there's a lot of moments in history and present moment that we can look to for how people are already organizing and working together to uplift a regenerative economy. So the Brazilian landless workers movement, the MST, was founded in 1984, is a really powerful example of a movement that practices deep democracy and self-governance at a large scale. So the MST represents over 1.5 million people living in nearly 30,000 autonomous settlements across most of the states of Brazil that were established through basically direct occupation of underutilized land. So mostly land that was before held by like large landowners. And this movement since 84 and was really building up to 84 when it formed, it faces constant challenges as international markets keep looking for workers to exploit abroad. But the MST has continued to resist, including joining the Via Campesina movement that we talked about earlier that brought together peasants all around the world in land reform and food sovereignty, and just securing that right of people, not markets, to decide what they produce and how they do it. So this is a movement that has faced a lot of struggles, which I think all resistance to this big, powerful institution and current economy do, but it continues to persist today. And then this one folks may have heard of in the Bay Area. But in 1999, a campaign started in Vallejo to stop a construction project that threatened Segura-Te, which was a 3,500-year-old Ohlone village and burial site located at Glen Cove. At first, Indigenous organizers showed up to city council meetings and they held demonstrations for 12 years, but the city still pressed forward with their plans. And then in 2011, after learning that the city of Vallejo's grading permits were about to become valid, so they were going to move forward, Indigenous organizers in the area realized they'd run out of options and needed to take a larger stand. And so April 14th, 2011, over 100 people gathered at Segura-Te. An elder lit a sacred fire, an altar was established, and there was a spiritual encampment that began to protect the Segura-Te. A community of protectors stood vigil together and tended the fire continuously for 109 days and nights without letting the fire die. And then following these actions, finally, the city did eventually enter a memorandum of agreement to protect the site. And the land trust for this site was founded in 2015. Throughout this whole, I was like reading and talking to folks that were involved in this project, and they've still had tons of, it's like so not similar, not different from treaties being broken in the past, but they have had multiple agreements be broken by the city still in the process. But they have a continued group of committed folks and ability to organize when needed to make sure that their vision for this land is secured. And so now organizers are working on a vision of the land, how it can be used to honor ancestors that were buried there, and then house community gatherings and cultural learning, and just restore kind of that alignment between people and land. And this is kind of the image that the Just Transition Framework gives us of how to, here we have the extractive economy on the left, regenerative economy that we're working to build on the right, and then some of the the strategies that help us get there. strategies being, and I'll go quickly through these, but stopping the bad. So we know what that means. The fossil fuel industry, exploitative institutions that exploit their workers, they need to go. So the framework really encourages us to be really hard in our lines around what is bad and make sure that we're ending it. Building the new, so that's sort of like the Segura Land Trust. How do we building kind of a new way of doing things and making it normal? Divesting from power and moving the money, so taking money away from both industry and that 1% and moving it towards ecological and social well-being for everybody. Changing the rules, that's policy change. Codifying it. Changing the story, that's narrative. So shifting away from this narrative of individualism and consumerism and one towards sacredness and well-being for all, and building a movement of movements. So kind of what Nick mentioned earlier too, of how are we seeing our interests aligning across different sectors of the movement and making the best use of that. Okay, and I think I have like a few more slides, but I think I'm gonna go ahead and close out now. I can send these slides out to folks if folks want to refer to them. But since we have just 9 minutes left in the space, I wanted to offer a couple discussion questions, but also welcome just any questions of what folks are sitting with. But curious if anything is coming up, whether you live in Portland or not, of a way that you see the extractive economy at play currently in your world, or anything that we need to move into a regenerative economy.
And we have until like 7:30. So if it's also fine.
Oh,
yeah,
great. Oh my gosh. Well, then I actually am going to read through all these. Okay. Then we have plenty of time. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So these are the 6 strategies that if you go back to this graphic, they're kind of the arrows that take us from extractive to regenerative. But then we have these principles of a just transition, which are sort of like the principles that we want to carry forward with us. So the first one is, what the hands do, the heart learns. So the first rule of ecological restoration is the restoration of human labor. So we are just like other living things. What we bring to the world is our work. And so in order to restore ecosystems at the scale that's required, we've got to restore our labor back into the web of life, liberate it from the chains of extractive capital markets. And I think a lot of times in climate spaces that are, we're thinking about climate in just a very that we are separate from nature, and that it perpetuates that narrative that like we are supposed to be saving nature. But I think this principle in particular tells us we actually have to be saving ourselves first, because we are being heavily exploited. And even if we are not the most exploited workers, maybe many of us have like a cushy job, or we work at our computers and it's like not that bad, but we are all connected to each other, and we care about those of our fellow workers who are being exploited super heavily. So yeah, what the hands do, the heart learns. The next principle is, if it's the right thing to do, we have every right to do it. So the basis for revolution is not only a struggle for power, the basis of revolution is rights. So it's when people are organized enough to assert their rights, or new rights, like the rights of Mother Earth that communities have been asserting lately, that the legitimacy of existing authority is tested. And the only way to assert rights is to exercise them. So the only way to even test if we have the right to free speech is to exercise it. We can say we have the right to housing, but it is only when we exercise that right and it ends up butting up against the rules that infringe upon these rights, and that have been designed specifically to infringe upon those rights in order to protect enclosure of land and wealth. Do we challenge the legitimacy of existing authority to govern? So I think this principle is just, especially this last part, it's saying, Let's move beyond what we are being told our rights are. Our rights are only what we actually are able to exercise. And if we can't exercise it, we're supposed to have a right to free speech or right to protest, but clearly we don't in this country, and in so much of the world we don't. Students aren't able to protest Gaza without being arrested. And in some cases, dealing with violence. So though our rules and our authority and our kind of militarized government is coming down on us for these things, this principle reminds us that if it's really the right thing to do, we have a right to exercise these rights and explore kind of the reality of our surroundings. What rights do we actually have? The next principle is, if we are not prepared to govern, we are not prepared to win. So we must engage in the daily practice of self-governance from the workplace to the state house. And we must not govern only under our existing structures. So existing structures we can use, but rather we must remake the shape of governance to be more democratic and ecologically responsive. And so this is how, when we organize to scale, we can perform civil disobedience at the scale of governance. We are asked by this framework to make the rules that we need, break the rules that serve the rulers. Ideally, we must make rules that break rules to assert deep democracy. And then the last guiding principle is that if it's not soulful, it's not strategic. And so our vision should really nurture cultures, souls, and spirits through song and ceremony, through practice and play. Our movements have to be irresistible and rooted in the wisdom of our ancestries, and that we should be aiming to create a culture that can hold us through the best and hardest of times, so that even when we're in a struggle, we don't have to seek refuge via the trappings of consumerisms and the privileges of empire. And this is how we heal from that crisis of disconnection from land, from each other, and from ourselves. And that's really what it means to decolonize. So this is a really sweet one. If it's not soulful, it's not strategic. If the work that we're doing drains us the same way that our relationship to land is draining the land, or our relationship to labor is draining people, then it's just not going to work. And then move us into discussion. And open, and I'm like, not sure. Are people able to unmute themselves? No. Okay.
I don't think so, but I think it is possible to like do the breakouts, I think, maybe, if you want to. But
I think I might just keep it big group chat discussion here. But I did want to, okay, there's hands being raised though.
We can raise hands, and then I don't really know how to, I can see like temporarily promote people to panelists. We can either take questions in the chat, like from text, or we can like promote people temporarily. I'm not sure.
Okay. Cool. I'm gonna stop sharing, and then I feel like, we could promote everyone into the panel. I feel like that would be good. Could you do that, Nick?
Yeah. First all panelist webinar.
Yeah, while we're doing that, I'll just drop these 2 questions that I have for this group, but super open to open to other reflections from the session and questions and to each other. And thanks for folks who are hopping off, but we're able to join for a good bit. The 2 questions I have for you all is, what are ways that you see the extractive economy at play in Portland or wherever locale you're in? So any of those pillars: resource, work, purpose, worldview, governance, and or
working for me. Just
it's not working.
Yeah, I could promote one person.
At a time. Okay.
There you go.
Well, then I think I'll invite folks to drop responses into the chat. Feel free to drop questions into the chat too. And then Colin. Oh no, Colin's gone.
And
Yeah, I see your question that other than the specific examples you cited, is there a larger organizing group advocating for / organizing around the just transition? Yeah, I would say there's lots of groups, even in Oregon, who are, I think there's groups who are naming that the just transition is the framework that they're using in their work. So in Oregon, we have the Oregon Just Transition Alliance, which is a coalition of a bunch of nonprofits that are working with kind of naming that the framework is what they're doing. I would say a lot of the labor organizing happening anywhere is part of a just transition. And any of the work, I mean, folks at Breach Collective, and maybe you can share, Nick, anyone else in your world doing this type of work, but folks that are doing work to end fossil fuel industry and to really develop a new workforce. There's so much workforce development work that's happening that is a huge part of the Just Transition framework, where we're creating not only green jobs, honestly, any kind of jobs that are well-paying and that don't harm the earth. Yeah.
yeah, there's like a history to the term, and it's a term of art in some ways, and the term is used differently by different organizations sometimes. I would say there is, in some places where to me is being used better, it's spanning the divide between like organized labor and community justice, and kind of like trying to bring those together. I think that's like where it works well. Some places it's kind of like divided, and workers are like really protective of the term inside of like organized labor, and then some places like community organizations hold on really tightly to the term. And so it can depend. I think in Portland and more broadly in Oregon, it's starting to take root across a lot of different organizations. So you see unions or organizations identifying with that framework, and then those people caucusing together in organizing efforts and in policy. So yeah, I would say like the Portland Clean Energy Fund coalition that advanced that policy is an example of like a just transition coalition that still exists. I think the pandemic did a lot to upend a lot of our organizing, and we lost a lot of people for a variety of reasons, like leaving jobs and or getting ill. But that framework still exists as a result of a just transition collaboration. And it's still like doing the institutional work too of that.
Yeah, I'm seeing this comment from Robin. I see the extractive economy and how we currently deal with people experiencing homelessness in Portland. So for governance, we're arresting and fining them, extracting the undesirables from the community, exploiting workers so they fear being homeless. That's a really astute example. Refineries being some of the main employers in the Bay Area, communities for Black and Latino communities, but at the same time causing, yeah, I mean, it's basically like trapping folks into labor and then forcing them to deal with the environmental consequences as well.
Yeah, and I would say you can see just in terms of like the broader politics that we're in right now, I think like prior to and around when the pandemic happened, we were as a state and as a city like voting in some really interesting programs that were trying to like create institutions that would promote care, would promote social solidarity, would promote worker rights, like Measure 110 and the Portland Clean Energy Fund and Preschool for All, Portland Street Response. And a lot of these programs are all basically like under attack. The kind of like immune system of the established economy is like coming really hard at all of those things at the same time. And I see them all as really closely related. And a lot of those coalitions, whether they identify with the term just transition or not, I see them doing really like related work.
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly that's going to happen if you are doing work that's actually changing the direction of the economy that we're forming, then we're going to have that clamp down and it's going to be a fight of some kind. And then, yeah, I'm seeing a sweet comment about part of what I want to get out of this. I want to help, looking to others for how to support climate justice with some time, maybe volunteering in the summer. It sounds like the Discord channel might be a good place to connect with folks about how to move forward from this course. From Samuel, I've been thinking about this in the context of Grants Pass versus Johnson. Money is being extracted from our basic need to sleep, whether they're private landlords extracting rent or the jurisdiction levying fines for camping. Absolutely. Another comment, extractive economy alive and well in the critical energy infrastructure hub. Local organizing work that's fighting against Zenith and other bad actors is simultaneously empowering and frustrating. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely that's a fight to stop the bad.
This is a really good question from Madeline. How do we make the just transition appealing to those in power? It's a framework that can be seen as demonizing their position of power, so the reaction is reflexively defensive.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think, from my experience, people who are in positions of power are not interested in letting those go. And I think, at least in the work that I've done, more than trying to appeal to them, it's building a really massive movement. That sort of movement of movements strategy in the just transition tells us, if we can find all the folks that have a similar interest in this issue or some sort of shared interest in this issue and mobilize them, and we're able to keep it sustainable, soulful, strategic, and sustainable, then we're able to kind of outmatch the power that folks currently in the powerful places are. Open to other folks' input or experience on that. I think the framework to me really helps me see that there's those folks that are in power, this economy is just there to benefit them. So they don't have really any reason to change unless there's really mass show of support for something else.
Yeah, same in my experience doing organizing is I can't remember a time when even like something that felt really common sense approaching power in like institutional power and saying like, hey, we should change that, and having it be automatically like, yeah, you have a good idea. I believe in fairness or equity. Let's do this. It almost always at the bare minimum requires like a show of force. Even if you don't end up having to like use your force in a way that's like really confrontational, like building power to be able to demonstrate that you have a coalition or a lot of people or some money or like whatever it's going to take, that you can get media, that you are willing to do direct action. We will talk later on this term, I guess, about power building, but yeah, I'm sure that some people are so charismatic that they can talk people into things, but in my experience, it's less, the negotiation isn't in necessarily like the communication of shared values. It's in the, building power and then sort of like leveraging that in creative and interesting ways.
Absolutely. And I'm seeing a note from Maria. While Portland is modeling some strong and promising climate practices, it's hard to feel like progress because it's hard to feel like progress is being made because there's actively extractive practices that contradict any regenerative efforts. So example of growth of biking and transit while also expanding fossil fuel infrastructure tenfold. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and that's why when we talk about the kind of like sixth strategy is, I think there's something to be said for like in any geography. So Portland, for example, we have to like make sure all of those strategies are covered at once, and it's a big lift, and it requires, I think, a bit of a skill up for all of us to be that coordinated and able to kind of map out, okay, who is focused on stopping the bad, stopping the fossil fuel expansion, making sure that people who are in power are not the folks that have that interest, while also building that new, which I feel like is what you're describing with the biking and transit.
Yeah, this is also a way that people with power or people who are making money off of extractive programs stay in power. There are basically no rules. They have to be honest. And in this country, we have like whole industries that are about sort of like hiding and masking what is real through like separation of time and space, or language itself is a battlefield. So, like there's categories like renewable fuels now that are becoming very popular, and these are things that aren't that dissimilar from fossil fuels in a lot of cases, or are not actually replacing fossil fuels, but they allow the industry to like stay in charge and to basically like keep regulators at bay. So they offer basically something that's not a serious change and create a whole language about it. And because they're in power, they sort of force everybody to respond to their frames. And then by the time you disprove their frames, are moving on, right? So these are techniques of power.
Lots of greenwashing, propaganda happening as well. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many, we look at like real solutions that actually move us into a regenerative economy that don't perpetuate any harm towards people or planet, and greenwashing solutions that are not that. Those are false solutions. And then there's police state in Portland is getting bad, and but exposing itself as well. The proposed distribution facility in the Park Rose and Argay neighborhood next to schools for the benefit of extractive economy to the detriment of people and planet. I didn't even know about that. That is definitely a good example. Intel, incredibly extractive and exploitative corporation in the Portland Metro, gaining lots of subsidies from the CHIPS Act to do their work. Yeah, also have very huge contracts with Israel. Can we change the story, stop calling it the critical energy infrastructure hub that gives it the feeling like there's no other way? It's critical then to place those hazards in neighborhoods. Appreciate that. Suburban sprawl extracts more and more time and resources by demanding long commutes and intensive energy use. Absolutely. How can we realize a regenerative local economy and healthy ecological and social well-being of city leaders? Heavily maintain a police state. Yeah, I mean, I obviously don't know all the answers, but I feel like we have to stop looking to our city leaders as the only people that move us forward, or create examples of ecological and social well-being. I-5 expansion kind of aligns with this worldview, a car-centric worldview. Oil resources, resource oil, governance, lack of investment in high-speed public transit options, purpose keeps us isolated. Absolutely. Yeah, purpose is also like transporting goods to be sold to keep certain people rich. Relationship with the PBA, Portland Business Alliance with our current city council is a clear example of an extractive economy on many levels. Yeah. Also very exposing of what interests run our city.
Yeah, there was a study that somebody released like in the last year. I'll try to find it and share it in the Discord, but it basically like mapped who lobbied the city of Portland the most. And like the PBA did like 90% of the lobbying over like a 5-year period or something like that. And they've managed to, I mean, they're also called the Portland Metro Chamber now. They had to do a brand change because people are getting wise to it. But they've like linked their salaries into like the street safety programs too, the like Portland street cleanup stuff. So they're very like they're like embedded in subsidizing their like own salaries through city government. It's a long time in the making, but yeah, I think people are really, smart to point that relationship out. Like it's the superstructure of like how you keep people with power like really leaning on decision makers.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was wild. I wasn't aware they had a rebrand. That is smart. Home Builders Association lobbyists in Salem, for sure. I think Oregon has a big problem with the rugged individualism issues mentioned in the article. And then also subsidies for Intel and Hillsborough School District massively capitally underfunded. Question about if the recording is going to be available, which I think yes. Transition will mean training folks to new work, cars to trains, for example, or military to domestic. How do we keep them invested in a transition? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, part of that is like connecting to the why of the transition and making this transition irresistible to folks. And I think for jobs, it's just having the jobs be better, like better pay, better conditions, better benefits, really, really like livable jobs that make life livable. I appreciate the growing participatory budgeting movement in Portland as a way as we get to tackle the area of growing deep democracy. It's a start for helping to create more transparency and accountability, our budget, and to show that Portlanders can directly make decisions on our public dollars because our current system doesn't allow it. Yeah, participatory budgeting is a great example of moving towards deep democracy. And thanks for an example of the regenerative economy at play.
It's like really hard to, it's a counterfactual, and in some ways it doesn't make sense, but I think right now it's like really hard, right, to be optimistic around politics. But it was like, wasn't that long ago when there were movements that were like in the streets, but also like doing policy and like joining forces and like really starting to take over local government and establishing like really creative programs that are they still exist. People are going after them. And, basically in order to stop Portlanders from doing that, every major media station just had to like just start doing like crime propaganda like 24/7 all the time. Like just stop reporting on anything except for that for like 3 years straight. And so there is like a lot of people power here and a lot of, I mean, I'm still really optimistic about the future in Portland with new government form coming on and everything. So
absolutely, yeah. And I think if anything, we have what we're lucky to have is to look to folks around the world that are doing this work and doing so in oftentimes more difficult governments than the one that we're in right now here in Portland. And I think the more we study those, the more we can see kind of how, I mean, one thing the more we can see is that the more we fight for what is actually right, the more the like uglier it gets just in general anywhere. So there's some resilience that we're asked to build. But then that can offer some hope too, that there's folks that resilience exists within people, including us here in Portland. And then just reading. Absolutely. Care jobs are low carbon climate jobs. Absolutely. Bringing impacted and frontline communities to the decision-making tables, making our own governing spaces. Absolutely. Yeah, because in dominant culture institutions, these experiences and perspectives are usually dismissed and ignored. Mass direct action from those impacted first and worst can make huge impact. Yeah, can you share the chat from tonight?
I think so.
That's a great idea because these are great. Portland is famous/infamous for its nonprofit culture where workers are getting underpaid and exploited while their labor is using to backfill market and government failures. Yeah, and we get manipulated into thinking like we should be all giving up our livelihoods for the good of the cause. Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. I think that's all I had for this group. Nick, is there anything you wanted to offer for discussion or close with?
I mean, first, just to thank you for giving a great talk. I loved it. It was very good.
Hey, thanks for putting this course together.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for showing up for the first session. I think it's a really good tone. Yeah, the world is moving around us, and like history is happening before our eyes. So, you know, stay plugged in to what's going on, stay aware, and we will be talking about myriad projects to get involved in locally and how to connect with one another over the course of the next 6 weeks. So yeah, get primed to think about power and how we take it together and build something better. I'll put the recording up as soon as I figure out how to do that and post the chat. And otherwise, let's connect on Discord. It's likely that next week we'll try the in-person hybrid stuff out of the Rebuilding Center at our office there. But I'll send out an email and let everybody know in the next couple of days. Thanks, y'all. Thanks for your chat.
Thank you all. Yeah, thanks, Nick.